I've always been fascinated by urban legends. You know, those creepy little stories that seem to sprout up everywhere, passed down like campfire ghost tales. Most people roll their eyes at them, dismissing them as myths or exaggerated warnings told to scare kids into behaving. I used to be one of those people, until I experienced something that made me question everything. Let me take you back to where it all began. I didn't mean to uncover the truth behind urban legends, nor did I want to. But some truths have a way of finding you, no matter how hard you try to ignore them. It all started a few years ago when I moved to a quiet little town called Whispering Pines. It wasn't much, a few streets lined with weathered houses, a diner that doubled as a town hall, and a gas station that seemed to be the town's social hub. To anyone passing through, Whispering Pines looked like your typical small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone. But there was something off about it. I noticed it within the first few weeks of moving in. People avoided talking about certain places in town, particularly the woods that bordered the outskirts. They called it the Vale, as if it were a living thing. Whenever I tried to ask about it, I'd get a nervous chuckle or a quick subject change. At first, I chalked it up to local superstition. Every town has its quirks, right? One legend stood out, though. It was the kind of story that stuck with you, no matter how much you wanted to forget it. They called it the Mirror Man. According to the locals, if you ventured into the Vale at night and found the abandoned cabin near the old creek, you'd see him. A pale, shadowy figure who mimicked your every move, but they said his eyes didn't belong to you. The story gave me chills, sure, but I wasn't about to let a campfire tale scare me off. Besides, I didn't believe in that sort of thing. Or at least, I didn't back then. The thing about urban legends is they have a way of gnawing at you, especially when you're surrounded by people who seem genuinely terrified of them. One night, after hearing yet another vague warning about staying out of the woods, I decided to see for myself what all the fuss was about. Armed with a flashlight, my phone, and a heavy dose of skepticism, I headed toward the Vale. The air seemed colder as I got closer, and the trees loomed like sentinels guarding a dark secret. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stories were getting to me. About 20 minutes in, I found the creek. And there it was, the cabin. It looked like something out of a horror movie, with its rotting wood and windows so grimy they might as well have been blacked out. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't about to back out now. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I half expected them to give way at any moment. But nothing happened. No mirror man, no ghostly whispers, just an empty, decrepit cabin. I laughed at myself, relieved and embarrassed in equal measure. But then I saw it. There was a mirror hanging on the far wall, cracked and clouded with age. It seemed out of place, almost too deliberate, like it had been left there as part of the legend. I walked closer, holding my flashlight up to get a better look. My reflection stared back at me, but something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just the cracks in the glass distorting my image, but then I noticed the eyes. My reflection's eyes weren't mine. They were darker, almost black, and they didn't blink when I did. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My reflection stayed perfectly still, watching me. And then, it smiled. I don't remember running out of the cabin. The next thing I knew, I was standing by the creek, gasping for air. My flashlight was gone, and my phone was dead. I must have dropped them in my panic, but I wasn't about to go back for them. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window and sat in the dark, replaying what I'd seen. It didn't make sense. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games with me. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I had the first nightmare. I was back in the cabin staring into the mirror. My reflection wasn't smiling anymore. It was crying silent tears that streaked down its pale cheeks. And then it spoke. "Help me," it whispered, its voice thin and ragged. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dream felt too real, too vivid to be just my imagination. But it didn't stop there. Every night the dream repeated, always the same. Me in the cabin, the reflection crying, begging for help. And every morning, I'd wake up feeling like a part of me had stayed behind, trapped in that mirror. One morning, after yet another sleepless night, I decided to do some digging. I needed to know more about the legend, about the veil, and most importantly, about the cabin. I started with the locals, but they were tight-lipped as ever. Some doors are better left closed, one old man told me, his voice trembling. Frustrated, I turned to the internet. There wasn't much, just a few mentions of the veil and some vague accounts of people going missing in the woods. But one story caught my eye. It was a post on an old forum, written by someone who claimed to have seen the Mirror Man. Their description was eerily similar to what I'd experienced, the reflection with the wrong eyes, the silent smile. But there was one detail that made my blood run cold. The last thing I heard before I blacked out, they wrote, was my own voice saying, "Don't let him out." I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just an urban legend. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything, the dreams, the research, the little things that seemed to go wrong every day. Like the time my bathroom mirror cracked on its own, or when I heard footsteps in my house when I was home alone. Something had followed me out of that cabin, and I was determined to find out what. If you've stuck with me so far, I commend your bravery. My story isn't an easy one to tell, and it sure as hell isn't easy to relive. But the deeper I dug into the truth behind the Mirror Man and Whispering Pines, the more I realized there was no turning back. So here I was, teetering on the edge of obsession. The locals wouldn't talk. Strange things were happening in my house, and the nightmares, well, they were getting worse. Something was calling to me, urging me to return to that cabin. Against every ounce of common sense, I knew I had to go back. Before stepping into the veil again, I wanted to gather more information. If I was going to face whatever was haunting me, I needed to be prepared. I started by combing through old records at the town library. Whispering Pines had a surprisingly well-maintained archive, tucked away in the basement of the library where dust seemed to fall like snow. After hours of searching, I found something that made my stomach drop. There had been a series of disappearances in the 1970s, all involving people who had last been seen near the veil. The missing included hikers, locals, even a couple of amateur paranormal investigators. The cases were all eerily similar. No bodies, no evidence, just whispers of a curse surrounding the woods. One name kept popping up, Eleanor Grayson, a woman who had vanished in 1976. She was a schoolteacher in Whispering Pines, and one of the few people rumored to have actively investigated the Mirror Man legend. According to one article, she was last seen heading toward the woods with a journal in hand. The journal was never found. That name stuck with me. Eleanor. Somehow, I knew she was connected to the reflection in the mirror, the one that cried and whispered, "Help me." The decision to return to the cabin wasn't an easy one. Fear had taken root in me, and every rational part of my brain was screaming to let it go. But the nightmares were relentless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in my own home. So, one cold autumn evening, I grabbed a flashlight, a notebook, and my phone, and headed back into the veil. This time, I made sure to tell someone where I was going, my only friend in town, a waitress named Clara, who had taken pity on me during one of my sleepless nights at the diner. "Don't go in there," she pleaded, gripping my arm. "People don't come back the same." "I have to," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need answers." She didn't say another word, just handed me a small silver cross on a chain. "For luck," she muttered. The walk through the veil was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for the smallest sound. When I reached the cabin, the sight of it sent a wave of dread crashing over me. It looked even worse than before, as if the woods themselves were trying to swallow it whole. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of those dark, unblinking eyes flashing through my mind. But I forced myself inside, flashlight shaking in my grip. The mirror was still there, hanging on the far wall like a waiting predator. This time, I didn't approach it right away. Instead, I started searching the cabin for anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I found it. Hidden under a loose floorboard was a small leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was clear. It was Eleanor Grayson's journal. I sat on the dusty floor, flipping through the journal with trembling hands. Eleanor had written extensively about the Mirror Man, her words growing more frantic as the entries went on. She described how she'd first heard the legend from her students and decided to investigate out of curiosity. At first, she thought it was just a silly ghost story. But then she'd started seeing him, in the corner of her eye, in her dreams, in every reflective surface. "He isn't just a reflection," one entry read. "He is something older, something that feeds on us. He takes pieces of your soul every time you look at him." The final entry sent chills down my spine. "If you're reading this, he knows you. The only way to stop him is to break the mirror. But be warned, breaking it comes with a cost. He will be free." I closed the journal, my heart hammering in my chest. Break the mirror? Let him out? The idea filled me with equal parts terror and resolve. If I left the mirror intact, he'd keep haunting me, or worse, he'd find someone else to torment. But if I broke it, what then? I stood up, the flashlight beam landing on the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, silent and still. And then, as if sensing my thoughts, it tilted its head and smiled. "Don't," it mouthed, though no sound came out. I froze, every instinct screaming to run. But something inside me, call it bravery, call it stupidity, held my ground. I grabbed a nearby plank of wood, my hands slick with sweat, and raised it above my head. The reflection's smile widened, its dark eyes gleaming. "Help me," it whispered, the voice echoing in my mind. I brought the plank down with all my strength. The mirror shattered, the sound like a thunderclap in the tiny cabin. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the world seemed to explode. I don't remember much of what happened after the mirror broke. There was a blinding light, a deafening roar, and a sensation like being pulled in every direction at once. When I came to, I was lying outside the cabin, the journal still clutched in my hands. The woods felt different, lighter, almost. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. I stumbled back to town, my thoughts racing. But it wasn't over. Not yet. When I got home, I found something waiting for me on my kitchen table, a shard of the mirror, glinting in the moonlight. If breaking the mirror was supposed to end it, then why did it feel like I had only made things worse? The moment I saw that shard glinting on my kitchen table, I knew this nightmare was far from over. But what scared me most wasn't the shard itself. It was that I had locked every door and window before leaving for the woods. Someone or something had been inside my house. I stared at the piece of broken mirror for what felt like hours, too afraid to touch it. It was jagged and sharp, about the size of my palm, and yet it seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain. Eleanor's journal was still with me, sitting beside the shard. I flipped through it again, hoping I'd missed something, some clue about what to do next. One passage stood out. "Breaking the mirror will not destroy him. It only releases him. To truly banish him, you must confront the truth he hides." The truth. What truth? The cryptic warning offered no further explanation, and I was left with more questions than answers. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made my skin crawl. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if I were being watched. Around 3 a.m. I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like nails gently rapping against glass. It was coming from the bathroom. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I got up, clutching a flashlight and the silver cross Clara had given me. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. When I reached the bathroom, I pushed the door open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The mirror above the sink was cracked. Not just cracked, shattered in the same spiderweb pattern as the one in the cabin. And in the center of the broken glass was a handprint. The next morning, I went straight to Clara. I needed answers, and I was done tiptoeing around the town's secrets. When I walked into the diner, She took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She motioned for me to sit, poured me a cup of coffee, and waited for me to speak. "I broke the mirror," I blurted out, my voice shaking. "I thought it would end it, but it didn't. He's still here." Clara's face paled. She glanced around the diner as if making sure no one else was listening, then leaned in close. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "You knew?" I asked, anger and desperation boiling over. "You knew what would happen and you didn't warn me?" "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," she said, her voice trembling. "People have tried before. None of them made it this far." "What is he?" I demanded. Clara hesitated, then sighed. "He's a collector. A being that feeds on fear, on pieces of your soul. The mirror was his prison, but it was also his anchor. Now that it's broken—" Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. "How do I stop him?" I asked. Clara shook her head. "No one knows. All we've ever heard are stories. Legends." Back at home, I examined the shard more closely. It seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, almost as if it were alive. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it, as though it held answers I desperately needed. I decided to take a risk. Placing the shard on the table, I sat down across from it, staring into its fractured surface. At first, all I saw was my own distorted reflection, but then the image began to shift. It wasn't me anymore. It was a girl, a young woman with long dark hair and hollow eyes. "Eleanor," I whispered. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I leaned closer, the world around me fading as the shard seemed to pull me in. Suddenly her voice rang out clear and desperate. "Find the lantern, follow the light." I jolted back, gasping for air. The shard was still there, but the image was gone. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. What lantern? Where was I supposed to find it? I turned to her journal, scouring the pages for any mention of a lantern. Near the end of the journal, I found it. "The lantern is the key. It was his before he was trapped. Find it, and you'll find the truth." There was no explanation of where the lantern might be, but something about the phrase, "it was his," made my blood run cold. If the lantern had belonged to the Mirror Man, it might be hidden somewhere tied to him, somewhere like the cabin. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to leave Whispering Pines and never look back. But I knew I couldn't run from this. The woods were darker than I remembered, the trees seeming to close in around me as I made my way back to the cabin. The air was heavy, and every step felt like wading through quicksand. When I reached the cabin, it looked different, less decayed, almost as if it were rebuilding itself. The door creaked open on its own as I approached, inviting me inside. I stepped through the threshold, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The room was empty, except for a faint glow coming from a corner I hadn't noticed before. There it was, the lantern. It was old and rusted, with a glass chamber that flickered faintly, as though holding a dying ember. When I picked it up, the light inside flared, illuminating the cabin in a cold blue glow. As the light spread, the walls of the cabin seemed to melt away, revealing a vast, dark void. Shapes began to form in the darkness, faces twisted in fear and pain, their mouths open in silent screams. Eleanor's voice echoed all around me. "He takes what we hide, our secrets, our guilt, our shame. That's his power." The faces grew clearer, and I realized they weren't just random victims. They were people from Whispering Pines. I saw the old man from the library, Clara, even myself. And then, in the center of the void, I saw him. The Mirror Man. His form was indistinct, like smoke twisting into the shape of a man. His eyes burned like coals, and his smile was wide and cruel. "You broke my mirror," he said, his voice like the scrape of metal on stone. "Now you'll see the truth." The Mirror Man was no longer a legend, no longer a shadowy figure hiding in the corners of reflective surfaces. He stood before me, his smoke-like form twisting and contorting, as if he could barely hold himself together. His burning eyes pierced through the cold blue glow of the lantern in my hand, and his smile. It wasn't a smile meant for greeting. It was a smile meant to devour. For a moment, I stood frozen in the endless void, surrounded by the faces of Whispering Pine's lost souls. They stared at me with pleading eyes, their mouths still locked in silent screams. I could feel their pain, their fear, as if it were my own. The lantern flickered in my trembling hands, the ember inside flaring brighter whenever the mirror man stepped closer. "Do you understand now?" he hissed, his voice wrapping around me like icy tendrils. "Your secrets, your lies, your shame, it's what binds me. It's what feeds me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind raced, trying to piece together Eleanor's cryptic warnings. The truth. I had to confront the truth. But what truth? The mirror man moved closer, his smile widening. "You broke my prison, and now you're part of me. Every step you've taken, every choice you've made, it's all led you here. You can't escape me." As he spoke, the faces in the void began to shift, merging into a single image, my own reflection. But it wasn't just me, it was a version of me that I didn't want to see. It was the part of me I had buried deep, the part I pretended didn't exist. I saw myself in moments of failure and regret. The time I lied to someone I loved, the mistakes I made out of selfishness, the guilt I carried but refused to acknowledge. The mirror man laughed, his voice booming in the void. "You see now? I am you. I am every part of you that you try to hide, and the more you deny it, the stronger I become." The lantern flared, and I realized what I had to do. If the mirror man fed on secrets and shame, then I had to confront mine. "I know what you are," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You're not just some ancient being or some supernatural curse. You're a reflection of everything people refuse to face. You're the darkness we carry, but you're only as powerful as we let you be." The mirror man snarled, his form rippling like a storm cloud. "You think your little epiphany will save you? You can't destroy me. I am eternal." He lunged at me, his smoky form enveloping me like a suffocating shroud. But as his cold grip tightened, I held the lantern up high, letting its blue light shine brighter. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I said, my voice breaking but resolute. "You're a part of me, but you don't control me." The lantern's glow intensified, and the faces around me began to fade. The mirror man screamed, his form unraveling like a frayed rope. As the light consumed him, I felt a surge of clarity. Memories I had long suppressed came rushing back, moments of pain and regret that I had tried to forget. But instead of drowning in them, I faced them head-on. The mirror man's form shrank, his screams fading into whispers. "You can't, you can't." "Yes, I can," I said, my voice firm. With one final burst of light, the lantern shattered and the void dissolved around me. I found myself back in the cabin, the journal lying on the floor beside me. The mirror was gone, and the air felt lighter, freer, as if a weight had been lifted. When I stepped out of the cabin, the woods seemed brighter. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the sound of birds and rustling leaves. It was as if the veil itself had been lifted. Back in Whispering Pines, the change was subtle but undeniable. The townsfolk, once guarded and fearful, seemed to breathe easier. Clara met me at the diner, her eyes wide with relief. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, though the weight of what I'd experienced still lingered. "It's over, for now." She didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. Some truths, I realized, were meant to be faced alone. Life in Whispering Pines returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. The nightmares stopped, and the strange occurrences around town faded away. But I knew the mirror man wasn't truly gone. He couldn't be destroyed, not entirely. He was a part of us, a reflection of the darkness we all carry. But as long as we faced that darkness, acknowledged it, and refused to let it consume us, he had no power. I still keep Eleanor's journal, a reminder of the journey I took and the truths I uncovered. And sometimes, late at night, I think about the faces I saw in the void. I wonder if they've found peace, or if they're still out there, waiting for someone to break their chains. Urban legends aren't just stories, they're warnings, reflections of our deepest fears and unspoken truths. The mirror man was one of many, a manifestation of the things we'd rather not face. So the next time you hear a tale about a haunted house, a cursed object, or a shadowy figure in the woods, don't dismiss it so easily. Because some urban legends are more than stories. They're mirrors. And sometimes, the scariest thing you can see in a mirror is yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.